Hello and welcome to the Blitz podcast. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL. Obviously, we're talking about defenses here, and this past week, week 2, was the week of no defense, I guess you could say, or bad defense, or whatever it may be. All the chalk plays kind of disappointed. Well, I won't say kind of disappointed. They were actually terrible, and all the ones that nobody was on, the Jets, the Browns, the Patriots, those were all the ones that put up solid scores, and Patriots, despite giving up 32 points, even had a decent game there. But, I mean, it was if you had a chalk defense in your cash games, though, it probably didn't really hurt you because they were all pretty bad. Ravens, Dolphins, and Rams were equally terrible.
Yeah, we're hoping for kind of a bounce-back week this time around. But still, I mean, this really doesn't change any of the process. I mean, you're still looking for defenses with a fair price, good matchup, and then just basically ignore the noise. Like, just what we saw last week with all the elite defenses falling flat. That's just, I mean, you just have to accept that with the defense position and the kicker position that, I mean, just pick who's in a good position and kind of go with it. But yeah, it's pretty fickle overall. So, yeah, just basically roll with it.
Yeah, like you said, certainly a process over results type of thing. Because if you start worrying about the right plays that went wrong, that's when you get off your correct process and start losing. So getting back to it, we'll start off with one of the few that actually did have a decent performance, at least from a DFS perspective this past week. The Patriots facing off against the Jaguars this week, who Jaguars certainly looked better, as you mentioned here, and actually got a win, which I saw first time since 2011 they have a 1-1 or better record after 2 weeks, which is pretty terrible, but good for them right now.
I saw it was their first September win since 2012, which is pretty amazing.
That's
its own right.
So brutal. And I mean, they've been one of the worst offenses in all of football over the past 5 years, at least, if not the worst, in bottom 5. So Patriots are fairly priced on both sites, and against this team that's still a young team, that they've got a couple big play threats, but this is a Patriots team doesn't give up a whole lot of big plays either, and this is going to be a pretty popular one because 1 week doesn't change the perspective on a team like the Jaguars. If you see consistent production from these guys, maybe something changes, but I'm certainly not a believer in this offense quite yet.
Yeah, and especially traveling on the road to New England, playing Tom Brady, that offense is on a roll. They'll likely be playing from behind for most of the game. So I'm expecting vintage Jacksonville here, what we've seen over the past 2 years in the fantasy-friendly performance. I'll surrender to New England here. So, I really like the Patriots. And the price tag, too, you can't really argue that. I think they have the best blend of upside and price in this spot on both sites. So, if you need to save a couple $100 or so and still get an elite play, I think the Patriots are the way to go.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. And then next up, the Seahawks, as we know, one of the best home defenses in all of football, probably still the best, even with the whole scenario with Cam Chancellor wants to pay money to not play. His stubbornness, I don't think he's going to win that battle, but that's not going to matter a whole lot this week with Jay Cutler out for a couple weeks. Got Alshon Jeffrey still not 100%. Maybe he's closer to 100% by this week. Maybe he doesn't play at all. I don't think anything definitive's come out yet anyway, but we got Jimmy Clausen starting here, and as we know, I feel like journeyman would be more of a compliment than I'm willing to give Jimmy Clausen at this point. He looked terrible when he did come in this past week. Obviously, it wasn't a great scenario. You don't have many weapons on that offense that are healthy right now. So this right here adds up to a scenario where you're going to be paying up for this defense, but you got a really nice floor and really big upside with a guy like Jimmy Clausen under center tonight or this week.
Yeah, and you have to consider they're $600 more than New England on FanDuel, $300 on DraftKings. So just kind of playing around with that and what you have in the rest of your lineup, just going back and forth between the two. But yeah, at home you got this angry Seattle defense. They don't like starting 0-2, and now they return home, their first home game of the year against the Chicago team who is just reeling, to put it nicely, with Jimmy Clausen under center. It sets up perfectly, really. And they're a popular defense, and they're probably going to be one of the best defenses if you can afford them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like you said, 0-2, going back home. Not quite a must-win yet, but I mean, for a team with high Super Bowl hopes like they have, it really is a must-win, and I don't imagine any scenario where they don't play very well in this one. Next up, a team that was good this week. We didn't see much ownership of them, but they played well on defense, and this is a team that does have some playmakers on defense, although a name that not a lot of people look at. And that's the Cleveland Browns facing up against Oakland Raiders, who Week 1 were completely shut down most of the game by the Bengals. Week 2 had some success against the Ravens, but that Ravens defense just looked absolutely horrible. And the Browns over their first 2 weeks, while they're only 1-1, their defense has looked it's looked fine. Really, a lot of the scenario with the Jets and that big loss that they had, they did give up 31 points, but it was a field position battle. There was a lot of turnovers, a lot of short field scenarios for the Jets. So if you just look at the score, it looks like they got crushed, but that really wasn't the defense's fault.
Yeah, and a lot of people forget that the Browns were actually pretty good defensively last season as well. Just because they're overall not such a good team, people tend to write them off. But this is definitely a favorable situation for them. They're at home against Oakland, traveling across the country to play them. And as we saw last week, we had the Niners traveling east, we had the Chargers traveling east, and both of those offenses really kind of fell flat on their face. A similar situation could really hold true for Oakland this week. And something has me thinking that Oakland's going to be patting themselves on the back all week after that win, and maybe come out flat plus the travel factor. So I think this is a pretty decent spot here for a value play in the Browns. And I mean, what we saw them last week, at least we know they have them in it. They have it in them to put up a big fantasy performance. So that furthers their rationale as well.
Yeah, and we'll see how good they feel about themselves when the Ravens go 6-10 this year. So that win might not be so great by the end of the year. Next up, the Steelers against St. Louis. A defense that actually looks really good for the majority of this game. We see they did give up a lot of yards, but you got to look at the game script, how this game played out, because this is not – they played much better than the total yardage indicates. A lot of garbage time points for the points and yardage for the 49ers. I mean, they had a 75-yard touchdown at Torrey Smith. So all in all, if you look at the numbers, looks like a bad performance, but the defense actually played really well. And, I mean, the St. Louis Rams offense – I guess they're better than the Eagles if we're going off numbers, but this is a team that just looked absolutely horrible. And the Redskins defense actually has looked decent over 2 weeks, but certainly not a defense that you should be putting up that type of performance. I saw it was one of their worst, one of the Rams' worst performances in a decade, something of that nature for their total offense. And the Steelers, not a great defense, but certainly above average defense that's got a good chance to hold down this really bad offense.
Yeah, and then you can go back and look at the Rams in Week 1, and they put up some points on Seattle, but they had a punt return for a touchdown. They had some good field position, got kind of lucky there. So just a different story, kind of an anomaly there. So we really saw what this Rams offense is all about last week, and they definitely have a ways to go. They don't have any real playmakers on this team, at least at the moment, no one willing to step up. So even though they're on the road, I kind of like the Steelers just for that reason. As I said in this article, they're probably more of a GPP value play. I would rather have the Browns for a cash game because I tend to gravitate towards home teams in a situation like that. So, I would say they're a GPP value play, but just because the Rams' offense is so bad, they're definitely on the board.
Yeah, and then certainly you expect that the offense already looked this good this week for the Steelers. Le'Veon Bell coming back. This could be a scenario where they get up big, and we see Nick Foles trying to air it out with really no weapons to throw the ball to. But only weapon that we really saw, and his best moment was his Instagram post, if you saw that one, the Stephen Bailey one about Richard Sherman. If you haven't seen that, you got to check that out. That was not something I can repeat on here, but it was pretty funny. GPP plays the Houston Texans, a.k.a. the Houston J.J. Watts, against Jameis Winston and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who they did look good, but it was more of a product of the team they were playing looking really, really bad. And obviously now Drew Brees, it's been indicated he's not 100%. Either way, that's not a good Saints team on defense or on offense right now. So I'm not buying much at all into that performance. And I don't quite think that they're as bad as they showed Week 1. I think they're a mediocre team at best. And Houston, I mean, J.J. Watt himself could end up getting a couple sacks, get a couple interceptions. We've seen him pick off passes at the line. Any defense with him on there against a bad to average offense is a defense I want to target in GPPs.
Yeah, and I was unfortunately watching a lot of that Tampa and New Orleans game,
I'm sorry.
as I had a lot of Saints players on my lineups that really kind of disappointed me. But that's neither here nor there. But New Orleans really didn't get any pressure on Jameis Winston. He just sat back there in the pocket and did whatever he wanted. Looked all across the field, found Vincent Jackson in the corner, and was able to make an easy throw. So I'm not expecting that to be the case this week. You have J.J. Watt up front. You have one of the best defensive lines, one of the better defensive lines in the NFL. They should get plenty of pressure on him themselves, not to mention, blitzing at random times as well. So I'm guessing he's going to be very uncomfortable this week, forcing some throws, leading to maybe a couple turnovers on the road here in Houston.
Yeah, so similar to what we saw week one, pressure in his face, and there's no way around a lot of pressure in this game. So if he can't get creative in the short passing game, then good luck to him this week. Obviously, Mike Evans, maybe he's actually involved this week. But even with that, if you don't have time to throw, rookie quarterback like that, not going to end very well for him more often than not.
Yep.
Next up, the Cardinals against San Francisco 49ers, a team who ultimately ended up putting up decent numbers on offense this past week. But like we said, that was a game script kind of thing. They were down by almost 30 points before they started scoring touchdowns and did put up some numbers late. But the Cardinals are not only an opportunistic defense, but a defense that has a lot of great playmakers. I mean, scored 2 defensive special teams touchdowns this past week against the Bears. Now they get San Francisco, who has a couple of pretty good players, but really no one guy that you have to worry about. Go ahead and dare Colin Kaepernick to throw the ball down the field because that's not going to end well more often than not. And if you take his splits first half, second half last week, he was pretty terrible in the first half.
Yeah, and that's exactly my point here. I think Cardinals at home, that offense is playing great. They should jump out to a lead, and then you put Kaepernick in a hole, put him in throwing situations, and that's a matchup that I really like, especially for this Arizona secondary. So, yeah, the Niners are one of those teams that they're a lot better when they're protecting a lead, able to establish the run. That may not be the case here, especially on the road. And so that's why I kind of like Arizona as a GPP play. Granted, they're similar price point to a team like New Orleans, or not New Orleans, New England, sorry. They're actually the same exact price on FanDuel. So that's where the GPP comes in, even though they are in a pretty good spot, is I would rather have New England for cash games. But a pretty decent pivot is Arizona, and as we saw last week, the chalk elite defenses aren't necessarily a given. So there is some rationale to going against the grain in a tournament if you're trying to get a little bit of diversity in your lineups.
Yeah, and depending on what site you played, we saw those chalk defense we mentioned that let people down on probably 50 to 60% of GPP lineups. So you find the one team, one of the few teams in GPP set you apart, and it's fine if those teams go off because they're really not going to hurt you in cash games there.
Right.
So, all right, thanks for hanging out with us here. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Lots of great content for NFL and every other sport at dailyfantasycafe.com.